So I'm walking out of the courthouse right now where we just had the verdict. President Trump came to address reporters in the hallway immediately after. He came outside the courtroom huddled with some of his advisors, sort of like calling a play, maybe talking about what they were going to say. And, hang on. Making sure that I don't get in trouble. I think the motorcade is leaving.
Donald Trump has been convicted on all 34 counts of falsifying business records. The announcement came after 5 o'clock this evening in a Manhattan courtroom. And outside of the courtroom, this was the scene. Trump has become the first former U.S. president convicted of a crime. His sentencing is scheduled for July 11th. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Elahe Izadi, back again today to capture this extraordinary development in American history. We're going to begin our coverage right now and continue our analysis tomorrow with a special edition of The Campaign Moment. Washington Post national political reporter Isaac Arnsdorf was in the courthouse as the verdict was read in what's been dubbed the hush money trial, which started 6 weeks ago. Hi, Isaac.
Hi.
Isaac, as someone who has reported on Donald Trump for a long time, and I wanted to start by asking you, what was your own reaction when the verdict was read? What was going through your mind?
Well, we had a little bit of a roller coaster at the end because the judge came out at 4:15 and said, we're getting ready to send the jury home at 4:30. And then we got a note from the jury saying, actually, we have a verdict. If you could just give us a few more minutes to fill out the form, we can give you the verdict. So then we're all waiting there until 5, knowing that there is a verdict, but not knowing what it was. And you could see Trump, when we thought that we were going home, Trump was like having a great time. He was looking very cheerful, hanging out with his lawyer. They were laughing, they were smiling. And then, the mood totally changed. He was suddenly very solemn, just like staring straight ahead. And unfortunately, we couldn't actually see his face when the first guilty was read because of all times for the video to not work. So the reporters in the courtroom were looking at the back of his head, and the reporters in the overflow room, the video was down. And by the time the video came back and we could see his face, it was one of the final counts. And at that point, he was frowning. He was looking straight ahead. He was sort of slumped in his chair, but he didn't say anything. There was no kind of big reaction that we saw.
Wow, that's so interesting that the actual moment when he had to really immediately process this news, no one could really see it except for a handful of people who had a clear view of him. Right after Trump left the courtroom, he did hold a short news conference. Let's listen to a little bit of what he said.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6% in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here.
So, Isaac, clearly he's very angry, defiant. It also sounds as if he was prepared to deliver remarks like this. What did you hear in these remarks?
Yeah, I mean, it's really the same thing that he's been saying in those little hallway interviews throughout the trial. The difference being we know the outcome now. And actually what he said about the final verdict being on November 5th is really the same thing that the Biden campaign put out in a statement right about the same time. There's still only one way to keep Donald Trump out of the Oval Office, at the ballot box. Convicted felon or not, Trump will be the Republican nominee for president. I actually asked Trump in that hallway if he was going to drop out. He didn't take the question, but he was very clear, we're going to fight on, and that this wasn't changing anything for the campaign. The campaign has already been so centered on this issue of his prosecutions and his criminal liability. Mm-hmm. And that right away, even before Trump got a chance to speak in person, the campaign was ready with a message to their supporters asking for money and identifying him as a political prisoner, which is the term that he has been using to describe people charged in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. So, they were already setting up this idea that there was a connection between those prosecutions and this prosecution, and, just continuing to ratchet that up now.
Yeah, these things are so connected now. Let's first dig into these 34 counts because, we need to know exactly what we're talking about. And as a reminder, these were felony charges around falsifying business records linked to payments made to the adult film actress Stormy Daniels. And this was ahead of the 2016 election. And these payments were made for her silence about a sexual encounter that she said she had with Trump. So how would you just summarize what this guilty verdict on all 34 counts? What does that verdict say? What does it mean?
Well, it means that the jury ultimately bought the prosecutor's theory that Trump was ultimately responsible for this scheme, even though he wasn't the one making the ledger entries, even though he wasn't the one opening the bank accounts, and even though the only direct evidence of him kind of ordering that or instructing that or wanting that what came from Michael Cohen, who is a convicted liar, not the world's most reliable witness.
And his former fixer.
Right. Well, and it was, he was convicted of lying to protect Trump, and now he's not doing that anymore. And it was supported by a lot of phone records and text messages. There were other witnesses who attested to other instances where Trump was kind of in on the scheme overall, just not those specific acts of falsifying the records. And so what this means is that the jury was saying, yes, I mean, the way that you presented the facts and the way that you presented the law in New York State of what it takes to make a conviction, it holds together. And that the defense, Trump's lawyers' attempts to poke holes in that, to say, don't trust Michael Cohen, that they didn't prove that Trump actually did anything, that there was actually any crime here, was not convincing. And you heard immediately after Trump's lawyer made another attempt to say actually that the judge should put this verdict aside because you couldn't possibly reach this conclusion without relying on Michael Cohen's testimony. And the judge didn't go for that, unsurprisingly. I mean, a big part of what the prosecution was trying to do with their closing argument was to bolster all the corroborating evidence around Michael Cohen, that even if you think Michael Cohen is problematic, here's why the case would still stand.
So do you think that's why the jury arrived at this verdict, that the prosecution made this very strong case that even if you dismissed Michael Cohen as an unreliable witness, if you believed what Trump's lawyers were saying, which is that he is a liar and you shouldn't be listening to him, that really this was the strength of the case? Or was there any particular moment, because you've been covering the trial, that you think now in retrospect that was very consequential, that it led the jury to make this decision?
Maybe we'll get the chance to hear from some of the jurors themselves to talk about what happened in the room. I mean, the only thing we can say, we know that they asked to hear again some of the evidence that had specifically to do with testimony about basically what Trump knew and when he knew it. And, I think what that points to is that they were zeroed in on this question of Trump's direct role in the scheme, but ultimately looking at the scheme as a whole, because some of that testimony had to do with not the Stormy Daniels payment themselves, but other meetings and other payments that led up to it. And so what that sort of looks like is that the prosecution successfully established that basically there was this conspiracy between Trump and Michael Cohen and the National Enquirer to suppress these stories that would be damaging to Trump's campaign. And that ultimately the Stormy Daniels one, which the records that he was charged with falsifying were related to, were part of that larger conspiracy that he was clearly involved in and aware of.
After the break, what could happen during sentencing? We'll be right back. Okay, now let's talk about what happens next in the immediate. I mentioned earlier that his sentencing is scheduled for July 11th. That's actually just a few days before the Republican National Convention. But talk me through, what does Trump face as a potential sentence, and who is setting that sentence?
So the judge will determine the sentence. Technically, on paper, the charges carry each count. And there are 34 counts, and each one carries 16 months to 4 years. But realistically, there's no way that the sentence would ever be 4 years times 34 counts. So it's going to be up to the judge whether jail time is an appropriate sentence at all, or whether it'll be some kind of detention either in one of his properties or in another facility that isn't Rikers Island. There could be some kind of probation or just a monetary penalty. And that's going to be decided in July. Trump will certainly appeal, but that appeal will almost certainly not get resolved before the election.
And just very quickly, is it possible he could go to prison? Has the judge indicated, Judge Juan Merchan, has he given any indication of his feelings of sending a former president to prison?
Well, I think, Merchan has addressed this in the context of Trump violating the gag order, saying he really, really didn't want to have to take that step, but he didn't feel like the fines were getting the point across to Trump. Now, that's different from now that there's actually a conviction. I think Merchan has also been clear about wanting Trump to view this as a big deal and wanting Trump to not get any special treatment that any other defendant in New York State criminal court would get.
Mm-hmm. So, Isaac, there's obviously so much to unpack about the political implications of this verdict. But right now, we can say that Trump can still be elected president, even as a convicted felon. As you mentioned, that's not something that, is barred. But what can we say in this moment about the impact this could have on his ability to campaign and also just the campaign itself?
So between now and July, he'll be more capable of campaigning than he has been for the past 6 weeks when he was stuck in court. After July, if there's some kind of carceral sentence or some kind of sentence that limits his movements, then that could have a huge impact on his ability to campaign. And, as for the political implications, I think that the polling about how people would feel about this hypothetically is not really going to matter or is not really going to hold. And we just need to give it a chance to sink in.
Why? Why is that? And what did that polling say? And what will you be looking for?
Well, because just historically, statistically, hypothetical questions tend not to be predictive in polling. You have to give, because people react differently when it's real and when, Trump's going to have his chance to weigh in on it and respond to it. And the Biden campaigns and Democrats are going to have their opportunity to message it. And so then it kind of takes some time to shake out.
So I would imagine that's a big question for you going forward, to see how voters are going to be responding to this.
Well, and especially, people who said, I do care, or I would care, or I wouldn't care. And, now that it's actually happened, how do they feel?
As always, the best way to know what's going to happen and what's happening is just to continue to report, right?
Right.
Well, Isaac, thank you so much for joining me.
Happy to be here.
Isaac Arnsdorf is a national political reporter. He joined us from Manhattan on this historic day as Donald Trump, the former president and presumptive Republican presidential nominee for this November, was convicted on 34 felony counts. We have much more for you at WashingtonPost.com, and we'll be back tomorrow afternoon for more in-depth analysis with Aaron Blake and Ashley Parker. This episode was mixed and produced by Ted Muldoon, with additional production from Rennie Svirnovsky. It was edited by Renita Jablonski. Thanks to Elle Calabrese and Anna Ashbrenner. I'm Elahe Izadi. Talk to you again very soon.